Welcome. Well, now here we go. We get started talking about how to prepare your art materials. Hopefully you've had a chance to review everything that's listed there on the first week's module. What I want to do next is just kind of take you through some of these processes now that you have your materials in terms of where to get started. So you may have decided on a couple different palettes, or if you got the plastic one that's in the kit, that's totally fine. You'll be set. So I'm just going to show you one of my many palettes here. Again, this next video is going to cover things like the half pans and the full pans and the travel palette. You're able to purchase these. At least I know the half pans for sure, probably the full pans on Blick. But watch the next video if you're interested in that process under the next heading for some of those more advanced materials. And what I'm going to do right now is just talk about how to set up the basic palette. So you can see right here, my yellow is getting pretty low. So what I want to do is not be stingy on my paint. So I'm going to take the tube, I'm going to work the back end of the tube first. So rather than squeezing up here, squeeze on that back side initially, right? As far away from the nozzle as you can. And then depending upon how big your palette is, you're just going to fill up that well. This is called a well in a traditional palette like this, or you'd have a cake if it's one of those movable ones. If it doesn't move, it's called a well. If it can be portable, it's called a cake, for informational sake. But anyway, so I'm going to fill up that well right there, and you can see now that's stashed up. And I used, I don't know, a quarter of my Cotman Winsor Newton watercolor here, maybe something like that. So you don't want to be too stingy in terms of filling up your paint on that process there. So I'll go ahead and just demo one more time. Again, pretty straightforward. I'm just going to unscrew the lid. This one happens to be Winsor, or not a Winsor Newton, but this is a Van Gogh, which is another really good brand. So you can see this tube's getting a little bit closer to running out. But I'll bet you I can still get this well pretty close to filled, even with what's remaining in the tube. So even if I need to just kind of take it and bend it over and work the remaining watercolor out. There's actually a great product out there called a tube ringer. And I thought it was kind of gimmicky at first, but what you can do is you can run your tubes through it and it will squeeze out every last little drop of paint. Even more beneficial when you're oil painting and using tubes there, get your money's worth. So you can see I could probably squeeze a little bit more out of that, but I don't necessarily need to. So you want to do proper maintenance on your palette and refill these, every so often once they start getting low. So the other thing I want to point out is notice what I've done here. I've tried to keep like all the oranges together, all the reds together, greens, so on, blues, violets, and then breaking into my yellows. So whatever system you have, now you're going to have a much more simplified palette. You're going to have 12 colors, which will be plenty for you to get started if you ordered the kit online. So I want to talk about a few other materials you might want to consider getting. This is a Viva paper towel. In fact, let me write that on here. So I have this marker. Convenient. So this is a Viva paper towel. You can find these at like Albertsons, Fred Meyer, etc. And they work really, really great. So I'm just going to peel off one here. They're a lot heavier quality than other brands. They're really thick and super absorbent. And especially when you're doing printmaking or oil painting or acrylic painting, these towels are so much easier to clean up. But I like them for watercolor too. And you can fold them up and kind of make like a little makeshift sponge if you want. Speaking of sponges, there's a lot of watercolorists that prefer to use a sponge like this. So this is just from the dollar store, cheapo, regular sponge. And you can see I actually cut it up to fit my cakes on my travel palette, right? So the cakes wouldn't move around. They're actually cut up. But the thing I wanted to illustrate here is the same idea. I'm trying to keep my greens together, my browns, the warmer tones, the blues. It's a little bit more challenging in a half cake and full cake scenario. but that's the same idea of how I set up my travel palette, okay? So you're gonna squeeze that watercolor out, and the idea is that you want to keep all those colors grouped next to one another. So that's how you're going to get started. Next step is, if you want to invest in a little hand mister like this, again, I bought, I think, like a 2-pack of these at the dollar store. They're super handy. So it's just a matter of hydrating this, and I can reuse all these colors. I can reuse this area that is in my palette here. I can mix from here. Or at the end of the day, if I want to make it nice and clean, I can take a Viva. This is where the Vivas come in really handy. And I can just clean that pocket out. I generally kind of leave it because unless it's a really dirty, contaminated area, I can generally use that color again. But it just depends. Like if you're somebody that likes to have a really nice clean surface to work into, that's how you do it. A little squirt of water there, move to a clean part of the Viva, and we're going to have a nice clean area of the palette. So in that other video, I did mention the option of something like a Chinese mixing tray, which I highly recommend too, because it's going to give you a little bit more mixing area than what you have here. And I have several, in fact, and I use them all the time. And they're great. And on that materials video, if you're interested and you want more mixing area than what you might have on your palette, it's not a bad investment. An old dinner plate, or you can go to Goodwill. Sometimes you can get lucky and find something there that might work as well. I did want to take a quick moment and just introduce some of the other materials that you could consider getting that are not listed on the kit itself. So this isn't going to be needed for several more weeks. But at some point in this class, you're going to need a Mr. Clean eraser, or even the no-name brand will work just fine. And you can find these at the dollar store or your local grocery store. You could pick them up the same time you decide to get your Vivas, if that's a direction you want to go. But you are going to need a Mr. Clean. The squirt bottle, little Mr. bottle. You don't need a big one. In fact, I suggest something kind of on the portable side, just for your water, is another good consideration to pick up. This again isn't necessary, but it's something I like to do. This is a larger size squirt bottle, and I have it filled with rubbing alcohol. And we're not going to get to this assignment till I think week 4. But if you want to invest, again, when you're at the dollar store and you want to pick up a larger squirt bottle, or if you have one laying around the house, you just want to be careful to mark it. So I have an A here for alcohol, so I don't get that mixed up with water by accident, because it will do something entirely different to the watercolor. But you're gonna have to be patient, find out what's gonna happen there. So you may also want to collect some salts between now and week 4 or 5. This is a sea salt. You can use kosher table salt. That works great. A couple different kinds of salts. Just regular old table salt works great. But you are going to need to have some salt. And again, if you're making a trip to the dollar store, that could be a good place. You're going to need some plastic wrap or bubble wrap. Even if you're getting stuff in the mail, like from Amazon, whatever, you can use that. And you can just crinkle it up, and it's going to work great for that additive assignment. But I just want to give you a little bit of warning, because those are a few things that are not on your materials list. Again, another thing that isn't entirely necessary is an apron. But if you're somebody who's really into clothing and you're worried about things getting stains on them and that sort of thing, it's probably hard to get in on this camera angle. But this is just an apron, like a cooking apron, again, if you're at Goodwill or something. And the watercolor, for the most part, is water soluble, but there are some chemicals and pigments that might stain your clothes. So just be aware of that, but watercolor is pretty easy to clean up by and large, okay? So we've talked about how to load up your palette, some of those extra materials that you might need. Now, in addition to that, obviously you're gonna need some kind of water container. So here you can see this is just a thing of empty cashews from Costco. Plastic container is probably about half a gallon in size, something like that roughly. And whatever you get, just make sure it isn't glass, because it will slide off the table. It will inevitably find a way to break. So I highly recommend making sure that it's plastic and just working with that. plastic bucket, but don't make it too small, okay? You don't want like a little tiny pixie cup worth of water unless you're traveling, right? But when you're set up at home, try to have something around the half-gallon size to work from. So that has you basically set up, and just that's really all you need to know to get going. Now, typically I've got a marker just so you can see what's going on, but typically what happens is, you know, the artist is going to go ahead and complete their drawing, you know, in something like graphite, typically with watercolor, especially if you're a less experienced student, you might be more comfortable initially just working in graphite. But just to show you the basic concept, what you're going to do is you're going to kind of start out with whatever your drawing might be here, okay? Simple figurative study, okay? And then now that I have my water mixed, I have my mister, right? I can bring my palette down here just so you can see, okay? So now I'm good to go. So my water's off camera here, pardon the reach. But what I'm going to do is now I can come in and I can start to use these watercolors. So if I want to go after a flesh tone, what I could do is I could take a combination of a couple different colors. So I'm going to take this sort of yellow ochre right here, come back to my water. Let me move this water over here so it's not so awkward. Apologize. Might be off camera a little bit, but it's going to be better than me reaching across the screen. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and start the little yellow ochre base. And then if we're going after like a Caucasian, I should mention this, like a Caucasian type flesh tone. If we were going for a different flesh tone, there'd be a slightly different recipe. It might be a little bit more blue mixed in there. You know, if I'm talking about mixing a flesh tone for, like, say, a Japanese individual, then I would get in and use a little bit more blue and brown off of this mixture I'm going to show you. If it's an African American individual, then we'd be inserting a little bit more blue into the mixture. But all flesh tones are going to kind of start with the same basic kind of recipe, where you're starting with something that's kind of neutral. Now I'm just going to use a little bit of red here to bring up the contrast. Okay, now what I'm going to do is, now as I change colors, just to illustrate, I'm going to come back in here and I have to clean out my brush. And you see, I'm just using just a little bit of watercolor. A little bit of watercolor really goes a long ways. So I could probably get a little bit more bold than that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I can just come in here, start to apply my flesh tone. I think I can get a little bit bolder than that. Okay, come in here and start to apply my flesh tone, my base flesh tone that I'm just going to work into. All right, into the figure. Just to give you a really basic idea. And I want to work pretty thin and pretty light initially. I could even start to come in and say, okay, this person has, let's go with a little bit more of a, how about yellow? Go with the blonde hair. Okay, come in here. We can just mask in the hair. Anyway, I'm not really doing any kind of demo except just to show you how the materials work really quick, just to give you an idea. And you want to start really light and then gradually start to work darker. And I'm not going to expect you to start with something like this subject matter wise. You'll be working a little bit simpler, but just to show you how direct and how fun these watercolors can be. We'll give her a blue shirt. Okay, so you see that's a nice basic lay-in, but what I want to do from my palette standpoint is have my colors in the same place every time, so I'm not going back and getting confused in terms of where they're located. So I have my water bucket, my palette that's set up, whatever mixing surface you're comfortable with. So consider if you want to get something larger, a dinner plate, a white neutral dinner plate. You want something that's kind of white and off color. You are going to find that the plastic palettes are not quite as easy to mix on. The watercolor will separate a little bit. So that's why some of the little more expensive palettes are nice to consider. Whether it's the travel style variety, and in that last lecture I listed 2 different size palettes. So whether you want to go something like this that has that metal surface, it's just a little bit nicer to mix into, and these are a little bit more durable. But again, I'm just kind of a little palette snob. It doesn't really matter if you're using the plastic ones. In fact, that's how I started myself. But basically what I wanted to do is just lay this out, give you a really quick idea in terms of how to get started. And what I would do is wait for these layers to dry or work into them wet to wet. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and you're going to learn about all these different washes coming up. But that's how you load your palette. That's how you get started with your materials. If I wanted to, I could come back and use this sponge, and I could pull moisture out of my brush to control it, or I could use a Viva that, you know, if I wanted to just, I've even seen some watercolors that use the whole roll itself and kind of just go like this. But I think it's a lot better if you just kind of pull out a sheet at a time and you blot it as you go there. One other method that works pretty well for a water container, for those of you that are thrifty like me, I like to just save my old laundry detergent containers, and they have a nice handle on them here. And then I'll just cut the top off of that laundry detergent container, and just using a pair of scissors or a straight blade or whatever, and that makes a great water bucket. But I typically use these, and you can see this one's well used, you know, or I just use something like that. I mean, if you want to go to the dollar store and purchase something, you can, but chances are, if you keep your eyes open just as you're doing your regular cooking or whatever, your laundry or something, you're gonna have a nice bucket or something to work into. You do want to kind of rinse the remaining residue of the laundry detergent out if you decide to go that direction. So anyway, that's the tutorial for today. That was mainly just to teach you how to load up the palette. Keep them on your radar, a few of those supplies that you also need to get that are outside of the kit. And that's all I have right now. I'm excited to see what you guys are going to paint this quarter. Welcome to this class. You're at the fun part of the class. Take care, my friends.